It's all about big card data and big game hunting. But before we get to that, today's podcast is sponsored by Security Unlocked, a new podcast from Microsoft focusing on artificial intelligence and machine learning in security. Check out the links in the description below. So, what a weird week it has been. It's sort of been a truncated week, if you will, because there was a holiday here in the US, and then there was also an inauguration this week. So there was news, but there wasn't news, but there's still a lot to talk about because it was, again, just a busy week. And of course, there's always the question, which is always my favorite part. But before we get into that, let's just dive into the news, shall we? So one of the things Microsoft did this week is that they invested in smart cars. Well, more specifically into the self-driving car game with an investment into Cruise. Now, I believe Cruise was a spin-off from GM, but Honda is also involved, and Microsoft is tossing some money into this company. And I think the play here is for the potential of big data, if you will. What I mean by this is that Microsoft knows that connected cars make a lot of data, and the data needs to be stored and analyzed somewhere. And of course, where do they want that? They want it in Azure. But Cruise is a little bit more interesting, I think, from the perspective of that this is a company that is targeting self-driving cars. Now, it's supposed to be somewhat vendor agnostic, meaning that like anybody could go to them and buy their product and then put it in their car and have self-driving cars. That's really glossing over at a super high level. It's not exactly that easy, but that is what this company is pursuing, is self-driving vehicles, and Microsoft very clearly wants to be a part of that. They don't have their own in-house self-driving car initiative, and so this is a good way for them to get into that segment without being the primary player of owning the company. Now, it's important to point out that obviously Google has investments in this area, and so does Amazon, and so now Microsoft is joining the fold, and they're betting that Cruise will be used by hopefully several companies, and that all their data will be coming back to Azure. So it's sort of a longer outlook sort of play. It's not so much a gamble, but it's more of a bet on the future, and that this company will truly be able to build a self-driving vehicle, or at least the technology to enable that. And so that when those partners start using it, it'll come back to Microsoft. So on the team side of life, there's a new history menu coming. Now, there already is a back button in the top left corner, and if you click it, it takes you back, but you're kind of going backwards blind. And so if you're familiar with how a browser works, where there's a drop down and you can jump to a specific point, that will be coming here in the very near future. And it's a nice little update for those of you who are pretty heavy into Teams, mostly because we've all been in that situation where you've worked on a file and you can't exactly remember where it is, but you know it was in Teams, and so that will help you find all that. Here's a little bit of an interesting one. There's some big things going on with Win32, specifically the Win32 API, and Microsoft has a project called Win32 Metadata, and they're hoping that with this tool, more languages will be able to make use of the Win32 APIs. Right now, it's primarily like a C-based access point, and so they're trying to expand the languages that are going to be able to interact with Win32 APIs. I'm not quite sure where they're fully headed with this. I'm not sure if they're trying to make it easier for developers to start writing native applications for Windows. I mean, that's never really a bad thing, but we'll see where this project goes. And so they're effectively like sort of doubling down on Win32 and saying, like, look, this is the future, and we're just going to try to make it as flexible as possible. And so that's one of those things that you should keep your eye on. Nothing really changing today, but long term, this could have some bigger changes about how people build applications and develop for Windows, which is a pretty cool thing. Microsoft also launched the Surface Laptop Go in India. The Surface Laptop Go is like the Surface Go, but in a laptop form. I expect that this to be a pretty big high volume seller. Speaking of high volume seller, next week Microsoft reports earnings. So that I believe that is on the 26th. So it's usually the middle of next week. Microsoft should be reporting earnings, which we should see. I'm hoping to see like Surface over 2 billion. That will be interesting. We'll also be looking at like Office 365, Microsoft 365 subscriber numbers, if I can get that out there, Game Pass subscribers. There's going to be a lot of things to be looking for, but keep in mind that earnings comes out next week, and what prompted that is that the Surface Laptop Go, I expect to be a pretty high volume seller because it's at a pretty low price point and it's targeted at entry level, and in my opinion, it is a much better entry level device than, say, the actual Surface Go tablet, because hey, it's a laptop, which is much easier to use for the vast majority of people in most scenarios. So be on the lookout for that. Microsoft List is also now available for iOS, so if you've been holding out and not using it because of that, there you go. Android is coming soon, but it is not available as of the time they're recording. Big milestone also this week for some popular Microsoft software. Edge, and this one's a little bit hard to believe, is turning 1. I guess it's been kind of a crazy year and we all just kind of forgot, but Edge, the browser that Microsoft has built, is officially 1 year old. So remember, this is based off of Chromium. This is not the old Edge, which was based off of, I believe, what was it, Spartan Core. So this is completely based on Chromium, and by all accounts, I've been using it for probably 6-7 months now. Sometime over the summer I think I converted full time, and it's fine. Like I don't really have any issues. There's a couple new features, including a new sidebar search, tab sleeping, which is kind of an interesting idea. So if you have a tab that is open, and who doesn't have a million tabs open, and you're not using it, it goes to quote unquote sleep, or kind of hibernates, so that it stops sucking down resources in the background. It makes the browser just a little bit more friendly, because browsers are known to suck up a lot of resources. And so there's that. There's history and tab sync. There's also a new password generator, and so Outlook.com emails will now show up in your new tab page if you have that configured. There's some new Fluent design icons, like crazy. We're still talking about rolling out Fluent like umpteen years after it was announced. There's also some new themes too, by the way. Microsoft just built out some custom themes. You can go download them and make your browser just a little bit more customized. They're not super flexible. If you're familiar with what you can do on Chrome with customization, it's effectively like the same thing over on Edge. So nothing too crazy, but hey, if you want to change the color up, you can now go do that, which is it's never a bad thing. I shouldn't have down on it. So let's go to like the major highlights of the Microsoft news. There's one thing I do want to point out that is outside the realm of Microsoft. It's Intel. Intel has been sort of in the news, good and bad, right? They have a new CEO coming on board. He's an old person. He started at Intel, went to VMware, and now he's back. They've been in the news also for, obviously Apple has their M1 chip, by the way, and they've been on the downside of a lot of negative news. So it's good to see that they reported that they had a really strong quarter, and PC unit volume sales were up 33% year over year, thanks to record notebook sales. Now, I think we can obviously point to some of that for people working at home, just needing new laptops because they don't want to use their old thing that they just barely were getting by with, so they bought a new piece of hardware. But anyways, that's good for Intel, some good momentum, some good cash injection as they make some tough choices coming ahead, because there's a lot of speculation about what will they do. Will they go to fabless, meaning will they go the AMD model where they don't own the fabrication shop, but then can Intel get the same priority as a company like Apple with their M1, or Qualcomm, or somebody like that? There's a lot of interesting choices. Are they going to go deeper into ARM? What are they going to do? We'll have to watch and see. Intel will be a company to keep an eye on in 2021, mostly because their future isn't as like bedrock as it was several years ago. And since we're talking about bedrocks, something that should be a bedrock of your podcast playlist comes from my friends at Microsoft, specifically Nick and Natalia, because they have a new podcast called Security Unlocked, where they take a closer look at the latest innovations in threat intelligence, security research, and data science, with a special focus on demystifying artificial intelligence and machine learning. On one of the recent episodes, I think this was episode 8, it'll be linked down in the description below, called Tackling Identity Threats with AI. They talk about how AI is being used to protect your personal data. For those in the security industry, or honestly thinking about entering into it, this is a great way to get familiar with about how professionals approach tough problems with unique solutions. Be sure to listen with the links in the description below. But things you should be listening to are what's happening in the gaming world. As I said, kind of a quieter week, but there are some very notable things to be listening to right now, if you will. I don't know why I just rolled that R, but we're gonna go with it. We're gonna go with it. It's a Friday. Be happy, be healthy, or something like that. Anyways, gaming news. So last week I sort of hinted that I'd be hearing a lot about some potential acquisitions in the gaming industry, not just coming from Microsoft, but coming from a wide variety of partners. And there was some big news dropping this week. Some of this I had heard about, some of it I had not, but all of it falls right into the same vein of what I had been hearing across the industry. First up, so the studio behind Microsoft's Flight Sim. So it's Asobo. I guarantee I pronounced that wrong. I have a very rich history of that. So it had been rumored that they were going to be taking an investment from Microsoft, and that's not the case. They did take an investment, but it was they sold effectively a minority stake into a company that you have not heard of, but now they have a minority shareholder, and they get a nice little capital injection. We don't know exactly what they're going to be using that capital for. but it was rumored that Microsoft was just going to come in and buy them because of how well Flight Sim has turned out. And so that is obviously not the case. And the fact that they took on a minority shareholder makes me think that they are honestly just not up for sale. And that's the model they wanted, is that they wanted a minority shareholder. It wouldn't surprise me if Microsoft came in and said, hey, we could do this, but we want to buy the whole company. And they're like, nah, we're not really looking for that. And so that's why they got that minority shareholder, and they got some new capital, and they are going to be doing the same thing they're going to be doing. So they're going to continue to work on Flight Sim, I would assume, for Microsoft. They also work with a bunch of other companies like Disney, and so they don't only just build Flight Sim. And so that is one thing. Zynga, their stock actually popped over takeover rumors, and then Tencent is also gearing up for a major U.S. or Korean investment. This is according to TMT Finance. That's where I think some of the things I have been hearing might be crossing over with Tencent, because I've been hearing about a major acquisition unfolding or in process somewhere along that journey. I'm starting up, so just keep your eyes and ears open. I don't know how long. People keep asking me what companies, and I don't want to say because there's multiple reasons why. One, it might fall through, right? And then people are like, well, Brad, you said they're going to buy XYZ company, and they didn't. You were wrong. Well, it's like they probably tried, but these things fall apart for a number of reasons. Look at the Flight Sim studio, right? They only took a minority investment. We don't know what these companies are looking for. I just know who's talking to who, right? It's like what kids are playing together at the playground. I can tell you who's doing that, but I don't know if they're going to end up playing kickball or if they're going to go home and eat their lunch, right? It's a complex narrative to try to unravel. But all I know is that this space is getting really, really hot right now. So other things that happened, this happened late on Friday after I recorded the podcast, but Xbox OS is getting a pretty significant update, and it's a very much like infrastructure behind the scenes thing. So they're now going to be able to flight. It's a new flighting system, and if you're not familiar with flighting, that's how Microsoft pushes data and updates to the console. And so they're working on a new flighting system where they can update individual components. For example, the shell, which is the user interface, like the thing when you hold down your Xbox button, like what pops up on the screen, that's the shell. So now they're going to be able to update just that without doing a complete system update. This is pretty cool because now they can do more agile updates. Now this system isn't fully rolled out. They were rolling it out initially to Omega users, but knowing how the Xbox platform works, I would expect that this whole flighting system should roll out pretty quickly because again, the Xbox OS and ecosystem is locked hardware. There's just a finite number of configurations. It's not like the PC world where they have millions. So be on the lookout for that. I think this is hopefully meaning we're going to get faster and more agile updates rather than like the waterfall style that Microsoft had been working with previously. Also, another big deal, at least for me specifically, so whatever, it's a big deal. The YouTube app on Xbox now supports HDR. So if you can go find those videos on YouTube, you can now watch them through this app. And so that's a good thing, and that's a big deal because I use that all the time. So other things happening that are just interesting. Digital Foundry did a really good video that kind of shows the narrative of like the PlayStation 5 is more powerful than the Xbox Series X. We know that like categorically is not correct. And every time there's a PlayStation 5 game that comes out that is on par with the Series X, it's like, well, Microsoft lied for 12 months about the Series X. No, they didn't. We know that the underlying components are better in the Series X, and Digital Foundry has a title that absolutely proves it. The Hitman 3, they did a really good deep dive analysis. There's a video on YouTube. You should absolutely go watch it, where it's almost frame by frame. But the TLDR here is that the PS5 version of Hitman 3 runs by 3200 by 1800, and the Series X actually runs at native 4K. So it's a much higher resolution, and it is able to do that at 60 frames per second, while the PlayStation 5 also does 60 frames per second. It looks like Hitman 3 developers IO, which they said they had their most successful launch ever, I believe, this morning, if my memory recalls correctly, with this title. But effectively, that they optimized for FPS, and the Series X was able to do it natively at 4K, where the PlayStation 5 was unable to do so. So let's just jump over to the questions of the week. Where is my thread? There we go. Every week I tweet these out at BDSams on the Twitters. And so if you're subscribing or following or whatever, you will be able to find that. And let's just dive in. And the reason why I get asked this every week, well, not every week, but a lot of weeks, is like, why don't you just pull up the Twitter thread? Because there's too many places questions come in. Like they come in the DMs and everything else. So I have a thread on Throughout.com that makes it so much easier to do this. So Mad Thina says, any whispers on what 21H1, that is the Windows 10 update for the spring, is coming or will be about? Or will I take a blog post of the Insider program that will be continuous streams of fixes for 20 20H2. So Microsoft, I believe the spring update for Windows 10 is just going to be minor bug fixes. They're very much pushing towards a larger update in the fall. That is when Sun Valley is expected to arrive, although we should start to see bits of that honestly much earlier. But the way that Microsoft does it, like 21H1 should be just about completed and signed off. Or I don't know about signed off, that might be incorrect, for now. And so most of the updates we should start seeing are going to be for the fall update. And so just be on the lookout for bugs and fixes for the spring, and then a larger update in the fall. But why the coyness and the silence? I don't know. Microsoft really could just come out and be honest and say it, but at the same time, they like to try to surprise people. And if they come out and say, this is exactly what we're doing, and then they don't deliver it, then there'll be people like me who will hold them accountable for making a promise. And so I don't think they're going to announce anything until they are absolutely 100% locked and loaded that this is going to all ship in the spring, in the fall. Sidechoker, hi Brad, hope you are doing well. Handful of questions this week. Why isn't Microsoft making an app like the Courier concept where the Microsoft services are all combined, like an Office online website where you can access all the apps in the upper left corner? Well, they sort of have that, like with Office.com. You can log in. It's not quite the Courier concept. The closest thing we have to that right now is Teams, and I'll be curious to see if Teams does evolve into something like that. Other questions include some news about a magnetic USB for Surface that could replace the Surface Connect. So the Surface Connect, I hope this doesn't unplug things, is this guy right here. If you're watching on the video, if you're on the audio, just know that I'm holding the Surface Connect. As of right now, Microsoft does have a next generation of that port designed. Now, when is it going to arrive? That's a big question. The reason why I say that is because when they make that shift, then they're going to have to go through the narrative of what about all your older peripherals, especially in the enterprise space, which kind of made me wonder if the reason the Surface Pro 7 Plus came out with the older port was so that they could eventually transition to it. I didn't put that in my writing, mostly because for reasons I don't want to start speculation, because if you think about it, they put this device out for businesses. That gives them a longer lead time in that market while they transition over the consumers and then the business. But right now, one of the things that Microsoft tells us time and time again, every single time they push out an update, is that businesses have this port everywhere and they don't want to change it because then all their business customers will have to go out and rebuy everything. I suspect that when they do make the change finally, they will have some sort of dongle or adapter that will make new devices work with old peripherals. At least that is what I hope. What can we expect from our Surface Spring event? Well, I don't think there's going to be potentially a spring, there's no in-person event, but the Surface Laptop Next Gen should be showing up here relatively soon. And I don't know if that's going to be like the 10X time, right? Microsoft still hasn't really come out and well, we've gotten the leaked builds. Microsoft hasn't come out and done their, this is what 10X is. This is why it's awesome. This is why you're going to want to use it. Here's the hardware it's running on. And so that very well could be aligned to a spring event. Do you know something more about Scalebound? No, individual game stuff is not typically my forte unless it's Halo Infinite and they want to tell me that I'm wrong even when I'm right. Silent Hero says, I know this is quite early to ask, but what is Microsoft's long-term strategy with Windows 10X? Well, their long-term strategy is the same thing as the long-term strategy with Windows RT, Windows 10S. They want to create a holistic, locked ecosystem that is agile, that is easily updated, and that never loses performance. Effectively, they want to create a Chromebook that's not made by Google, and they won't ever pitch it in that scenario, but that's what they want to go for. Initially, they were targeting things like they want an iPhone, but as a Windows OS with RT, and now Chromebook is sort of what they are chasing, and it's very apparent that 10X is right along those lines. So the long-term goal is to, if Microsoft had the perfect world, is that nobody would actually be running Windows 10 like we do today. They'd be running this entirely locked ecosystem of Microsoft hardware, software, and services, and that you have to that's just the way it is. But that's not where they're going to get. Now their goal is to create an agile, low-end, entry-level OS that works really, really well, especially in education, especially with younger customers who are kind of accustomed to the iOS model. That is their long-term goal. But their kind of short-term goal is to actually get people to like it, because that's been the biggest challenge with Windows 10S, right? People just didn't like it. Same with RT. They understood it, but they didn't like it. It looked like a duck, quacked like a duck, but it was actually a pigeon underneath. And so that is honestly their long-term goal, is just to build an entry-level OS, entry-level style OS that people will actually enjoy. Johnny77, my drop. ThreadLinked is getting popular again. Microsoft removing the family calendar. Apparently was supposed to return, but it's been crickets from Microsoft Will anybody bring this up and actually get them talking about it? Who knows? Actually, I probably should look into this, because I could honestly probably use it, but Microsoft Family Calendar has been a sore spot. It was pretty well done, and then Microsoft ripped it out, which we still don't understand why. Mr. PKI, as always, here is your favorite ending question of the week. Do you ever get a question for the SAMS report from a Microsoft employee? Yes, actually. So one of the interesting things about my sort of career or whatever, and this is same for other people like Mary Jo or Paul, is that we know a lot of people in like many different areas of the Microsoft tree, right? Or the Microsoft org. I mean, there's 100,000 plus people. And for a lot of times employees, right, they're siloed in their own org or whatever. And that's not a bad thing, but like just generally speaking, I talk to individuals across the entire company, definitely on like a monthly basis, if not a weekly basis. And so it's not unusual for somebody at the company to not be fully aware of what is going on in another org. That's not unusual at all, not just at Microsoft, but just large companies in general. And so, yeah, like we'll get questions all the frequent, I would say several times a month. I actually think, I don't think there were any this week, but several times a month it does happen. And then says, how many Microsoft employees are premium members of Thurrott.com? I don't know the specific answer, but I can tell you that there are a couple executives who have signed up for Thurrott Premium. And I know that because they use their @Microsoft.com email account. And so there's definitely some others as well mixed in there, but I don't have an exact number off of the top of my head. So interesting week, like I said at the top of the podcast, interesting week. And so here we are, wrapping it up January 22nd. It has been another fun podcast. As always, guys, very much appreciate you guys hanging out, stopping by. And as a reminder, today's podcast was brought to you by Security Unlocked. You can find links down in the description below or go directly to their site at securityunlockedpodcast.com. Give them a listen, give them a try. You won't be disappointed.